want to share with you just a brief little devotional message from the book of Daniel. In fact, this is probably going to be just a very short series of devotional thoughts that I'm going to share with you probably over the next several weeks. I'm actually going to refer to this as Daniel living above the crowd. Because it seems to me that there's a lot of parallels as far as the context and the culture of the day in which Daniel lived, and the circumstances and the challenges that he was facing. And how did he actually face it? How did he live it? How did Daniel live above the crowd? How did Daniel live above the culture of his day? And listen, I think that's a logical question to be asking ourselves here. So how do we, as contemporary Seventh-day Adventists, how do we live in the year 2021 above the crowd? Hey, listen, I say, what do you say we dive into Daniel? We dig a little bit deeper. From his life, I think there are lessons that are applications for us as to how we choose to live today. So there's just a lot that we can learn. But we're just going to take a brief look here at Daniel chapter 1. And I'm going to start in with verse 1. This is what it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. Hey, listen, in this opening salvo of Daniel, I think this is really one of the most heartbreaking, heart-wrenching verses of scripture that you're going to come across. This whole idea of Jerusalem besieged by Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. Hey, look, we know that in this besieging of Jerusalem, that young Daniel, as a teenager, is taken captive. And he's hauled off it's about 800 to 1,000 miles across the hot desert sands into a brand new land, a whole different culture and country, and a kingdom called Babylon. Hey, listen, think about this for just a moment. I mean, you gotta realize here, and I think we need to just pause for just a moment and recognize that Daniel is probably a late teenager, happily growing up, happily living in Jerusalem. So he has a family, he has his friends. Daniel, no doubt, is a teenager like all of us. I mean, he had goals and he had dreams and he had plans for his life. I mean, for Daniel, listen, it wasn't rocket science. I mean, Daniel wanted what pretty much all of us wanted. Daniel had already laid out the plan that he had for his life. He was going to go to a great university. He was going to acquire a great degree. He was going to fall in love with a great lady. He was going to get married and they were going to have a bunch of great kids. He would end up having a great career, no doubt have a very prominent place in the temple. He had a goal and a desire to do great things for God. But what do you do when your life ends up in Babylon? I mean, that's exactly what was taking place here with Daniel. So Daniel, what are you going to do now that you're in Babylon? I mean, the goals and the dreams and the plans that you have for life, I mean, they're gone. What are you going to do now that your life is in Babylon? Hey, listen, my friends, I mean, when you stop and think of everything that Daniel lost in the prime young life as a late teenager, I mean, it's staggering to consider how drastically life changed for him when he finds himself living in Babylon. I mean, I would suggest to you just several things right off the bat. I think, obviously, he loses his own culture. I mean, obviously, at home in Jerusalem, there is a culture that he's accustomed to. I mean, the way that you dress, the places that you go, the food that you eat, the music that you listen to, the friends that you have, the family. I mean, he loses it all. Because now, instead of the culture that he was raised in Jerusalem, all of a sudden, it's a brand new culture in Babylon. There's a whole new language he's going to have to learn, different food that you're going to eat, entire, completely different environment. Listen, it is absolutely stunning how much Daniel loses from Jerusalem to Babylon. Look, he even loses his name. I mean, his name is a name that would remind him. So his Hebrew name was a name that would remind him that he belonged to Yahweh God. But now he is given a brand new name that is to remind him that he is now under a different kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon. Do you realize that Daniel never made it back home to Jerusalem? Daniel lived and died in Babylon, living above the crowd. You know, I think probably, my hunch is, if we were to name the best known and maybe even the best loved story in all of Daniel, it would probably be in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel the lion's den. I mean, please, who doesn't know that story? I mean, everybody knows that story. You don't even have to be a Christian to be aware of or to have heard the story about Daniel in the lion's den. But you see, I would submit to you that we would have never gotten to the story of Daniel in the lion's den if we didn't first have the story of Daniel at the dinner table. Because that is the epic moment that starts this whole story in Daniel, is what happens right here in Daniel chapter 1. Because it was right here that he made a very cryptic, critical decision that no matter what, no matter where, whether it was in Jerusalem or even not here in Babylon, a place that he had never dreamed, never planned on being, but Daniel had determined in his heart that he was going to honor God no matter what. Even when it comes to this test right here of what to eat at the king's table. So listen, that actually happens, that particular epic verse is right here in verse 8. But you need to understand that from verse 1 all the way to verse 8, the king is in control. The king is in control of absolutely everything. So he literally besieges the city of Jerusalem, takes Daniel and a bunch of other young men, and of course others as well from Jerusalem. They end up in Babylon. And of course, he begins to make decisions. I want to have some young men, find the brightest and the best. I want them to come. I'm going to teach them. I'm going to train them. This is what they're going to wear. This is what they're going to learn. This is the language that they're going to have to start speaking. All of these changes are swirling around. Oh, and by the way, you're going to be eating from the king's table, and this is the diet of the king. And so that's the decision that Daniel was facing, along with his three friends. And you come to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Up to verse 8, the king is in control. Nebuchadnezzar is in control. But the paradigm shift takes place right here in verse 8, because this is what it says. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Daniel determined in his heart that he would honor God, that he would trust God, even in Babylon. All of his dreams, all of his hopes, all of the plans that he had for life, poof, they're gone. Now he finds himself under a completely different king, under a completely different kingdom. Everything has changed. His culture has changed. His relationship has changed. Even his name has changed. But you come here to verse 8, and Daniel makes it very clear that he is going to honor God. He's going to trust God no matter what. So look, you know the story. They had determined, look, Daniel and his three friends, they said, listen, we're not going to eat this stuff. This is unclean food. So that they go to the chief, said, hey, look, you're going to have to find something else. Look, just give us 10 days. Let us just, fruits, grains, nuts, vegetables, let us eat that. Just for 10 days. You can test this out. And of course, the guy is working for the king, and he says, what, are you crazy? I mean, if the king finds out about this, or if something goes horribly wrong with your IQ and your SAT stats, I mean, he said, the king's going to have my head. And it's true. I mean, when you stop and think about the management style, so you think of a leader, or a CEO of a company, and you think, okay, what's the management styles? And some will say, well, they're a hands-on management style. You go back and read about the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, he had a leadership style. He wasn't hands-on. He was heads off. You did something wrong, step out of line, step out of place. I mean, shoot, it's over. Please. So this guy who was in charge of these young men, yeah, he's the guy. This guy is, he's squirming. He's scared, but he goes ahead with it. Gives it the test. And then, look, I love this line. So at the end of the 10 days, so this is verse 15, 16. At the end of the 10 days, they appeared, they looked better, they were healthy, they were tested. And verse 17, you got to love this line. These 4 young men, here, very specific, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. 3 words. God gave them. Why? Because they had made the choice to live above the crowd. They had determined in their hearts to honor God. They were not going to just go with the flow and ride with the tide of the culture of the day. Listen, whatever happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. It was on our choice to leave Jerusalem. They could have easily compromised, but they didn't. They chose to honor. Daniel chose to honor God. I think about a story. Sharon and I lived in Northern California for a number of years. So we would drive through these huge, giant redwood trees. So they would have, you go up into Northern California, it's the redwood forest, the redwood trees, just these massive, majestic, massive, huge trees, these redwood trees. I mean, these are trees that have survived hundreds of years. Well, one of the huge redwood trees fell down. I mean, it crashed down. It was a 400-year-old tree. I mean, it had survived everything in those 400 years. I mean, think about it. I mean, storms and earthquakes and lightning and fire. That redwood tree had survived absolutely everything that the planet could hurl at it. But one day it came down. So I said, man, what in the world? How did this happen? I mean, it survived 400 years. What toppled this thing? And so they cut the thing into, looked at the heart of the tree. And you know what they discovered? Do you know what brought down that giant redwood tree? It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't fire. It was tiny little beetles. These little bugs that had worked their way in to the heart of that giant redwood. And over time, those little beetles ate away at the heart of that huge, majestic redwood tree until finally, one day, it tumbled down. Hey, listen, my friends, I think there's some application there when you stop and think about Daniel. Daniel, like this majestic redwood tree, that no matter what was thrown at him, his decision was determined in his heart to honor God, to trust God, no matter what, even in Babylon. Living above the crowd. Listen, can I share with you something? This is just so amazing. Do you realize that in the book of Daniel, that Daniel is referred to as highly esteemed on 3 occasions? So 3 times Daniel is referred to as highly esteemed. What do you suppose that is? I think I can tell you. Daniel was referred to as being highly esteemed because Daniel chose to live above the crowd. He chose to live above the culture. He chose not to compromise with the culture. He chose to honor God. He chose to trust God no matter what. Hey, look, I think one of the first lessons that we can learn from just this little devotional on the life of Daniel, I think that we can learn is this, hey, look, I want to live my life highly esteemed as well. I want to live my life so that little beetles don't come in and eat away because of the compromising with culture. I want to dare to be a Daniel. I want to honor God. I want to trust God, even when life doesn't turn out the way that I plan. Trust God. Honor God, just like Daniel. God bless.